Hello, everybody. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu, and I'd like to welcome you to Raising Multilinguals Live.
And hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. My name is Ute Limacharibold from Ute's International Lounge.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Rita Rosenbach from multilingualparenting.com, and today we have another fantastic topic to speak about, and that is role of teachers in supporting multilingual children. And to speak about that, we have, to our delight, we have Dr. Professor Piet Van Avermaet, who is the head of the Center of Diversity in Learning at the Linguistic Department of Ghent University in Belgium. Welcome, Piet.
Good evening, good morning. Thank you very much for this kind introduction.
Oh, there is more to come because you have done so much in addition to teaching multicultural studies, multilingualism in education and language policy at the university. Your expertise and research interests, they cover a lot of topics, really important topics for our children, multilingual children and multicultural children going to mainstream schools. So you research like social inequality and also language assessment, diversity and inclusion, integration and participation in education, discrimination in education, as well as migration. So you have many really burning topics, which are so important in today's world when the classrooms are getting more and more diverse. From many parents I've heard, and I've experienced myself as well, that when you send a multilingual child to school, instead of being regarded as the multi-skilled people, small human beings they are often seen as being deficient because they may not be fluent in the school language, and the focus on is what they don't know instead of what they do bring with their identities. So with all the research that you have done and all the different angles, so how would you, I know this is a big question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So how would you summarize the findings of what happens when a child's full linguistic and cultural repertoire is ignored, or in worst case, even excluded at school?
Well, thank you very much for this question. And indeed, it is a rather broad question. But let me first say that indeed most of my work, what I'd like to focus on is what are the mechanisms of social inequality in education and language. What we see over the last 2 decades is that language, and in particular the language of schooling, has become is more and more being perceived as the panacea, one could say, the main, or in some cases, according to some, the most important or sole solution in order to address that issue of social inequality and to provide maximum learning opportunities for all children. And this, of course, is interesting to observe, because on the one hand, you see that in the political discourses, language is put forward as the solution, but at the same time, in these same political discourses, we often see that language is also being framed as an obstacle for learning, and this is a fascinating contradiction. So on the one hand, language is seen as the panacea for social inequality, and on the same and on the other hand, that same concept of language is seen as the villain, as the obstacle for learning. Now, what we know from research is that indeed the language of schooling, or the language of instruction, is key for children to deconstruct and to construct knowledge. This is very important for parents, for teachers, and for children. Now, what is often that idea of the language of instruction as being key to deconstruct and construct knowledge is often restricted to the fact that, yeah, but all these other languages are standing in the way of that. And that's why what we often see as approaches, as solutions to address that issue is that what we call exclusive L2 submersion models. There's the deeply rooted conviction, that assumption that if we throw these multilingual children into a language bath, in a bath of the dominant language, then all the learning problems will be solved. What we know from research is that the opposite is true. I mean,
before you continue, so we are sure we got all of our audience with us. So you said an L2 exclusive submersion approach. So that means that you take a child who doesn't yet speak their school language, and then it's kind of immersed in the school language, and the expectation is that, and the only expectation is then that they will learn the languages, and the other languages are not kind of considered at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So so the idea is that, and what we see in many schools in terms of practices is that children are taken out of the regular classroom, the mainstream classroom. They are put what we call pullout classes. They are put for longer periods in a separate homogeneous classroom. And indeed, what we see is that it's mainly those children who are being perceived as having a language problem. I mean, we live in an era where language, specifically the language of instruction, and that people or children who speak another language, that they have a kind of deficiency, and that deficiency perspective is very prominent. So as a consequence, we think, okay, we want these children to give maximum opportunities to learn the language of schooling. Instead of keeping them in the mainstream classroom, we pull them out of that mainstream classroom. That's the assumption. There is no evidence that children who are pulled out of the regular classroom do better than when they stay in the regular classroom.
Okay.
On the contrary, most research shows that they are better off in the mainstream classroom, but with very specific support. Support by, for instance, an extra teacher. So these little moments of giving specific attention of a very specific language problem, be it in a maths class, a child that doesn't understand the instructions of the teacher, then sometimes the child can benefit from immediate feedback by, for instance, a language teacher. That kind of dynamic interaction through co-teaching is much more powerful in order to support the pupils in their acquisition of the language of instruction. Still, I'm not talking about what do we do with the multilingual repertoires. A second important element is that what we do see in the classrooms, in the mainstream classrooms, is that the practices are still to a large extent teacher-centered practices. In courses of 50 minutes, what we mostly have in primary and definitely secondary education in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, on the basis of research, what we see is that in most cases of the 50 minutes of teaching the subject, 40 minutes of the time the teacher is speaking. What we know from language learning acquisition and how we learn a language is that language production and language interaction is key to learn a language. We recently did a study in preschool children, the age of 3, and we looked at the frequency of the interaction and the quality of the interaction between the teacher and the pupils. And one of the things we did was we measured the amount of time of language production that the children had throughout the school day. Now here I would like to ask you the question, which of course the audience can answer, but make a wild guess what the amount of language production that these young children had from 8:30 in the morning into 3:30 in the afternoon.
Yeah, I know the answer. It's very,
In some cases, it was no more than 8 seconds.
yeah.
So we have to invest much more. And that's where we need to collaborate with teachers. We need to strengthen the teachers' proficiency and awareness that the quality of the interaction, if we want our children to learn the language of schooling, again, which is key, then we will have to change radically the interactional practices in our classrooms. That's one thing. And the second, which is the main topic of this session, is in providing opportunities for children to learn the language of schooling, but also to learn other subjects, we do not exploit their full linguistic repertoire. So, and I do think that we need to provide more opportunities and give and strengthen teachers' proficiency so that they, instead of putting the languages of these children aside, not allowing them to use these languages, often indeed banning them, and in some cases even punishing the children for using the language, we know from research that when we train our teachers to exploit the multilingual repertoires of the children for learning, that has a positive effect. What we also know is if we ban the multilingual or the plurilingual repertoires of children, what we know is that it has negative impacts on inter-ethnic friendships. Or reversed, from a recent study we did, we saw that when we work with schools who change their policy into a much more multilingual policy and exploit the plurilingual repertoires, we see that it has a positive effect on mixed friendship relationships. We also see that it has a positive effect on teacher perceptions. We also see that it has a positive effect on the beliefs and the practices of teachers. So we see positive effects at the teacher's level, but we see also positive effects at the level of the pupils. Cognitive, in the sense of it has a positive effect on their learning, and also non-cognitive, it has a positive effect on their involvement, on their motivation, on their their self-perception, and on their well-being.
And I can imagine, of course, I presume that hasn't been researched in the same way because it's not that easy, but that will have domino effects outside the school. If children come out of the school being more open, more accepting to other cultures, and then that will have a positive effect on the whole society.
Yes, yeah. We haven't done, in our research group, we haven't done research on that, but we, for instance, looked at the dynamics of having a more multicultural and multilingual classroom and what effects that had on the playground. Because one of the concerns is that if you allow the multilingual repertoires, that will lead to cliques and segregation on the playground. And the interesting thing we saw was that when the teachers create a positive environment with regard to the cultural and embrace the cultural diversity, and with embrace, I do mean more than just celebrating it, but really exploiting it, giving it status, giving the pupils agency, and the same for their plurilingual repertoires, we see that we see these differences in friendships in the classroom, but which is also being observed once they go into the playground. So while in a monolingual policy and practice, we do see on the playground indeed these cliques and segregation, small groups, it has a positive effect on more mixed activities, children mingling amongst each other. And it also impacts, that's what we know from interviews with children, it also impacts positively the perceptions of the children towards each other's cultural background and linguistic background.
That's so fantastic. It's so I'm so happy to hear that it's been found in research, and I can just hope that this will now also then transmit to the police and the policy makers because those are the ones who decide the curricula and so on, because that is the next big step where we need to get to. So the practices that you describe so far, translanguaging has been seen as the panacea of bringing in at least a bit more diversity and allowing children to use their other languages, presuming there is at least two speakers of the same language in the schools or within the classroom, so they can use their other languages. But you have come up, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have coined the term functional multilingual learning, and I presume this is what you were describing just before. So what is functional multilingual learning in a nutshell, and how does it then, you mentioned something already, but how does it in the classroom, how does it benefit the multilingual children?
Let me first give a bit of background before I explain what functional multilingual learning in a nutshell is, and let me tell you where it comes from. What we know from research, and I think work by Jim Cummins, but also the interesting work, the very longitudinal studies by Thomas and Collier in the US, who clearly show that if you look at the impact of two-way immersion models, so the real bilingual education, what we see is that it has very positive effects on also, for instance, reading comprehension in the language of instruction. So that's very clear. So in principle, in theory, I strongly embrace the idea to go for a model of two-way immersion, a teaching model of two-way immersion, like you have in Canada, like you have in other countries. However, and here I'm mainly speaking with regard to the European context, where we have, since Second World War, massive waves of migration. Due to that fact, and due to the fact of the last 20 years of an increased mobility and globalization, what we definitely see in a European context is an increased amount of children with different language backgrounds in the classroom. I mean, in some cases, in European schools, we see definitely in secondary schools up to 20, 30, 40 different languages being there in the school. Now, that has as a consequence that it, to some extent, put limits on such a traditional approach of bilingual education. That is often used by policymakers and by politicians. Yeah, but our classrooms have become linguistically so diverse that it doesn't make any sense to do anything. Okay, we agree, we accept the fact that bilingual education has positive effects, but we can't organize bilingual education. And that's why we came up with that concept of functional multilingual learning. The idea, yeah, but these languages are there in the classroom, exploit them. But I always find it very fascinating that when I make the comparison between linguistic diversity and the more general concept of diversity, I see that all teachers and all schools embrace and agree with the fact and acknowledge the fact that we need to exploit the cultural diversity of the pupils in the classroom. How they do it is another discussion, but we accept that and we do that. But when it comes to linguistic diversity, for one reason or another, we do not have the same discourse with regard to exploiting the linguistic diversity. Cultural diversity, fine, that's absolutely fine. Linguistic diversity, oh no, there we tend to disagree and we don't give space. So functional multilingual learning is the simple idea of, I'm a maths teacher. Let me give a concrete example. I'm a maths teacher and I have pupils with different language backgrounds in my classroom. There are two Polish children sitting in my classroom, or two Spanish children, whatever the language is. And I see in the eyes of one of these pupils that he or she is having a problem with the maths instructions I'm giving. And I know that the other pupil is very good in maths. And I proactively say to these two students, okay, explain it to each other. And you can use whatever repertoire. You can use a mix of repertoires. You can use Polish, but you can mix Polish with Dutch. You can even use others. You can use your even multimodal repertoire in order to communicate and to make clear to each other what the maths activity is about. Now then, here is where we have to be concerned about the fears of the teacher. And because the teacher is concerned of the fact, yeah, but will they be talking about the task? Maybe they will be gossiping about me. And thirdly, maybe they explained it incorrectly to each other. And finally, there is that deeply rooted assumption that 1 minute they've been speaking in another language than the language of instruction is 1 minute which is lost for the acquisition of the language of instruction. So I always say, and that's the basic idea of the simple idea of functional multilingual learning, let's reverse that whole idea. See it as an advantage, because that's also something that teachers say, I don't understand all these languages, so I'm concerned. And I always say, see it as an advantage. Because after that 1 minute that you have proactively allowed them to use the language for learning, you can invite them. And you can say, okay, guys, tell me what you've been talking about. Explain me. You challenge them to paraphrase what they've been talking about in other repertoires, one repertoire or a mix of repertoires, to paraphrase it in the language of instruction, which is the only language in most cases you as a teacher possess. When they have not been talking about a task with a lot of us, then you can intervene as a teacher. You can always do that. But when you see or when you hear that in their paraphrasing, what they've been talking about the maths task, there are some things that are not fully correct, then you can also intervene. This is what we call creating powerful learning environments. You give feedback on the spot by saying, okay, look, here you've been explaining the maths activity correctly, but from that point on, you made a kind of a mistake in your reasoning. It's a bit different. The fact that you challenged your pupils to paraphrase from their plurilingual repertoires into the language of instruction, these are powerful learning moments of language learning. So this is what FML is. Does it need extra resources? Does it need extra time? Absolutely not. I mean, it's just a change in mindset, a change in belief, a change in attitude, a willingness of the teacher to use the plurilingual repertoires as what I call a didactical capital for learning.
Mm-hmm. So as I understand, I like this idea pretty much, that it's all a moving beyond, let's say the fears or the assumptions that many teachers make when they are in front of a classroom with children with a very diverse linguistic background, and to give the children to not hide their languages, but to use them, to allow them to use them, to value them, and to exploit them. I like this word. We mentioned it several times now. And what I like is also the giving the agency to the children. So not being afraid of giving the agency to children. Yes, I have a question. Now, maybe it's slightly different from the ones who are coming, but I know that you have collected once a lot of doubts and fears from teachers, right? You had several lists in one of your conferences. And what would you say helps the teachers most to get beyond exactly these kind of assumptions, judgments, and fears?
Well, what doesn't help is just saying to the teachers and just providing with empirical evidence. Data are key and data are important, but that as such won't do the trick. What is important, at least what we experienced, is that you have to invest as a school for longitudinal trajectories of professionalization. But trajectories of professionalization where not just the external expert comes into the school and tells to the teachers or to the team, okay, this is what I think you need to do, and here are some examples, and just try them out. No, what is key is that you give ownership. We just talked about agency for the students. We also need to give agency to the teachers. They have to be active partners in that process of professionalization. It is their professionalization. They have to structure, to organize. You have to start from their concerns. And then what we experienced is it has to be longitudinal, it has to be intensive, it has to be a whole school team has to be involved, including the principal. It's not just a question, okay, the principal commissions one teacher and then the idea it'll spread around. No. And there are 3 levels at which, in order to realize sustainable change, there are 3 key elements on which we experience that we need to focus in that collaboration, in that co-creative process of professionalization with teachers. First, focus on the dispositions of the teachers. What are the teachers' beliefs? What is their knowledge? What do they know? I mean, what we see, and here again, I'm mainly speaking from my context, which is the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. I can't speak for a more global context. What we experience, and this is not a critique on teachers, but this is what we observe, there is a major lack of knowledge about how second language acquisition takes place. So we need to, there is a lack of knowledge with regard to what the assets of multilingualism are. We need to focus on these dispositions. But this has to go hand in hand with strengthening what I call the situation-specific skills. The skills, strengthening their skills, giving them confidence. I mean, this builds on an old concept of Bandura of 40 years ago, what we call self-efficacy. What we see with regard to plurilingualism is that in some cases there's ideological resistance. But in most cases, when you talk with teachers, when you work with teachers, is that they agree, yes, I need to do more. Yes, I accept the fact that I have to do something with these multilingual repertoires, but they have low feelings of self-efficacy. Their competencies, their feelings of competencies are rather low. So, and we need to support them to strengthen their skills in very specific, concrete classroom situations. And that these situation-specific skills can be different for a maths teacher than for a geography teacher, or for a teacher in a secondary school than for a teacher in a primary school. So a professionalization trajectory is not a one-size-fits-all model. It needs to be tailored. And the third element is we have to provide examples of good practice in order to change teachers' behavior. And examples of good practice is not just me telling what a good example of functional multilingual learning is. What we know from research is what is powerful, and there's still a long way to go, is exploiting video material in order to show to teachers how it can be exploited. The video examples is so much powerful. This can be used as a step-up. It can be done through videography as a methodology. It can be done through video simulation. We are currently working with video simulation, where you provide real situations to the teacher. The video stops, and then you ask the teacher the question, okay, what would you do now? What do you think of that practice? So that you have a kind of reflexive exercise with these teachers. And then the next step, but then you have to build trust with teachers. The next step then can be that you go into each other's classrooms, you film each other's practices, and then you jointly reflect on your own practices. But this is not something which goes from day one into day two. No. This needs time. But what we do know, if you go for such an approach that has more that can be more powerful in order to create sustainable change.
Yes, thank you. Do we have some questions from the audience to take in between here, or?
Meanwhile, I'd like to just comment on what has been said so far. It's really deep, and a lot of this I find is, as you mentioned, I think the word longitudinal is really precisely the case. It's something that takes a long time to implement, to make into a routine, make into a system that everybody believes. It's not just the teachers. Teachers, making them believe takes a certain amount of effort, but then making the principal, making everybody in that whole system believe in it.
Including parents, by the way.
Including
Yes.
parents,
Yes.
definitely.
Everyone.
Yes,
Everyone.
And it just seems like such a huge task, and how do we as in us, I find that raising multilinguals live, we are one of those people. I find that we're trying to get all these frontline, very cutting edge information and bringing it to the users, kind of thing. How can we help in spreading the message? How can we make this more believable, make this more widespread? It really made me reflect on a lot of things, kind of contribution that we can make as an intermediary here.
Yeah, I think Tetsu, with all, it's more than believing. It's being convinced that it's actually the better solution for everyone, and there is research backing this up. I would like to thank you, Rita. I would like to share a comment from Cloudy Sunny. I found this example really good. Yes, and you can always double check and let the kid explain what he or has now understood. I think a lot of teachers are still thinking it takes too long. So we were talking about the teachers and their biases, maybe. I don't know if we can talk about biases in this context. The extra time compared to not bilingual kids or monolingual settings in the classroom, I imagine she means. So this, with regards to what you just said right now, what can be done with the teachers, and I imagine maybe it has to do with the other question that we had, how you can implement it in the classroom, and you mentioned the longitudinal approach, so not just one coming in once a year and telling teachers what to do, but actually would you recommend then like a training that regularly gets updated with new practices, new ideas, and where the teachers also form like a group where they help each other, peer group, so to say. I mean, they are peers as well in that kind of setting, where they can say, well, this worked for me in maths, maybe it works also for physics, and it might work for biology, and why not also for, I don't know, PE, yeah, right? Yeah. So that they can mutually teach and help each other.
Yeah, no, it is indeed. I mean, what is important, and this is not only for this topic, but in many schools there is not always. I mean, there are nice examples, by the way, of schools where there is a culture of where teachers as a team continuously want to learn. So that is actually what needs to be created. A culture of exchanging your experiences, my experiences, providing a principal who provides time for teacher teams to really reflect, to share their ideas, to also share what didn't work, and that you can learn from that. That is important. The point that, and sorry,
Tetsu?
I forgot the name, but that one of
Cloudy. The comment from Cloudy.
Cloudy. Oh, from Cloudy. Yeah.
Cloudy, if I may, thank you very much for this comment. I fully agree with that, and this brings me, and again, it goes beyond the issue of this topic, but this is an argument which we often hear. Yes, but it takes extra time, and I don't always have that time, and it goes faster with the monolingual kids, and if I allow all these things, that has a negative impact on my curriculum. One thing is with regard to the curriculum, I think it is important to critically reflect on what is important in the curriculum and what is less important. I think this is often something which again teams not always do. But what is, in my view, the most important thing is that we ignore or do not acknowledge the fact that every child's learning trajectory is whimsical, and it is longitudinal, and it is not a straight line. Every individual child develops at a different pace and at a different speed. Now, here we are faced with what I call systemic hurdles. The fact that we have, and I don't know whether that's the case but I assume that in most cases, our school systems are organized according to year programs. And we start from the assumption that in year one or in grade one, all the children more or less have to reach the same goals at the end of of year one, and then we have the transition into grade two. The same assumption of an homogeneous group. Mm-hmm. Now, in that assumption, we take the average middle-class child as the point of reference, and all the rest deviates. And then we run into trouble. If we organize a more fluid system of individual trajectories, and there are examples of schools who actually do that, mm-hmm. then you have a much more powerful educational system than a traditional year classroom system. Mm-hmm. And then you can address much more and in a better way these individual learning trajectories of children.
Taking into account how most schools are organized exactly as you say. I know, for example, in the Finnish school system, especially in the higher grades, there are now different modules where you don't actually you spend a certain amount of time, but it's not year one, year two, year three. It's modules taken at different times. But I mean, that would be fantastic if we could reach that. But how far do you think we are from a situation where where we could, because that needs to come from above. It needs to be a fundamental change in the policies and the schools and the curricula before that can be implemented in all schools.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Rita, because again, I'm going to speak for the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. I mean, our educational system and schools have an extremely amount of freedom.
Okay.
The government or the policymaker or the politician or the Minister of Education by no means says that they have to organize their schooling in a one-year classroom system. It's fully open. Schools can choose. Okay. The only thing is, in primary, at the end of grade 6, I mean, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, we have primary from grade 1, which is age of 6, into grade 6, which is age of 12. At the end, as a school, you have the responsibility to show that all your children have met the minimum objectives that have been set by society, by the parliament. But how you do that is completely free. And yet, although there is that freedom for schools, we see that they all maintain that traditional approach of year 1, year 2, year 3. And if we think that after year 1 you are not as proficient as we think which is needed in order to make the transition into grade 2, then we keep you an extra year in grade 1. These are the dynamics we see. So there is openness in the schools in the Dutch-speaking part of that, and yet they don't take that freedom. Same for assessment.
Yes. I see what you say, and I think here, for example, here in the UK, where my children are going to school, it's much more rigorous. There are assessments, that national assessments, like yearly, where everyone is assessed according to the same standards, and then the schools are assessed based on that. But that's a completely different discussion that we're going into now. But if we come back to this functional multilingual learning, and you mentioned that you don't really need more time or extra resources, but you would need the right mindset. And I'm a little bit coming back to what Tetsu asked. How do you think? How can we, as some kind of, we consider as some kind of influencers in there? What can we do to support this development in schools? And also, I think, have you studied how parents react to this? Because I know many parents who would insist on their child being tested after 1 year so they know that they have learned something. So there's also that aspect.
Yeah. What our role as influencers, I always use the term advocacy. We have an advocacy responsibility, and you're absolutely right. And of course, our impact, we have to be careful there. Our impact is to some extent limited. What I experience is that in order to realize change, it's much more, for me, I find it much more difficult to work with with policymakers at a macro level, let's say at national or subnational level. I experience more opportunities at the level of the localities. For instance, what we do now very much is working with municipalities, with cities, who often have a responsibility, but who also have financial resources, who can bring schools together, who can bring teams of principals together, and working with municipalities and with cities often is, at least that we experience, is often a very powerful approach, because you are somewhere in the middle of working with one school, but actually you're trying to bring schools together in order to create more leverage. And if you do that at the level of the municipality, our experience is that works better than just traditional top-down policies. So it's a bit a mixture of bottom-up, but at the same time having that meso level, which is the city.
So I think my original comment where I wanted to get to is I think the emphasis on belief. You said culture. I also think that's a great word to describe it. It's like the whole system needs to believe that this works, even if it takes time. If we believe it's going to work, we'll do it. Because on a logistics level, I don't see it to be a very complex logistics thing. It's really, if you believe firmly that you spend the time and resources on it, it will happen. If you believe that, I think it can be done. And if I may, I may be opening a big can of worm here, but I'm thinking now that the world is becoming more online and we have more and more homeschooling and more parents getting together and making, kind of a small local task force teams. Do you think this will develop easier under such circumstances than to tackle the whole system, so to speak? Is this a hugely complex question? Maybe I'm going a bit too far here.
No. But let me first briefly come back to what you said, the importance that we have to try to change the beliefs. What we for a long time thought is that there is a unidirectional relationship between beliefs and behavior. What we experienced in the work we did with schools here in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium is that if you work with teachers and you intervene and you work with them at the practical level in the classroom, that often has a positive impact on their beliefs. And so it is a dynamic interaction between the beliefs, the managerial level, which is the policy of the school, and the practices and the behavior of the teacher. And you always have to work at these three different components. Whether the current dynamics we see amongst parents and the idea of online teaching might have an impact. Well, again, this is hypothetical, and I don't have any data on that, but I think it is quite well possible that some parents will gradually start to overrule the traditional formal system of schools.
Mm-hmm.
Now, having said that, then the next question is that a good thing? And here I'm concerned in the sense that theoretically there is a lot of potential, but here we have to be aware of the fact, and this is also beyond the topic of today, but I think we are.
That's fine.
We already were beyond that several occasions beyond the topic of today. But what my concern is that middle-class parents will have more opportunities to overrule and to organize themselves, and to assure that the quality of what they provide for their children will be, in some cases, even better than whatever. But my concern is that the low SES parents, the parents who have low literacy skills, the parents who have blue-collar jobs, the parents who have poor educational backgrounds, in more general terms, the parents who have less cultural and social capital, what we know from research is that they often do not have the networks, they do not have even the financial resources to organize themselves. So what might happen if we do not carefully monitor these dynamics is that the achievement gaps might even increase. So there, I think a government has to be concerned about certain of these dynamics. I fully understand that parents do it. Sometimes we see that in some schools the quality is not good. We see schools where the quality is absolutely high. Parents have more and more opportunities to organize themselves, but it needs resources, it needs networks, it needs to be able to understand what is needed in order to support your child, etc., etc. This is what we now see when there is a child from a middle-class background who has some learning problems. What we call, there is an increasing amount of shadow education, private teachers. I mean, poor parents don't have these opportunities, and that's why I always say the government has the societal responsibility to invest in an educational system, but it also has to critically reflect on the quality of that system, specifically from that equity and inequality perspective.
Thank you so much. makes us really reflect on the whole problem. We have to go bite-size in this discussion here. So I'm sorry I opened maybe a big can of worms, but
these are so important questions. I think we should. They are part of. I mean, yes, they're perhaps not on topic of what we announced, so to say. But these are so, because.
Sorry for that.
No. Please don't be. We went there ourselves. It wasn't you.
But it's prompted so much discussion in the chat also. Yeah. So it's really an engaging topic, and we're very thankful.
Yeah, because our topic is a small part of that bigger and in the end more important topic. Because what is more important when we speak about children in school is that everyone has got the right to the same level of education and being able to get as much out of it as possible. So definitely this is such an important topic. But if we go back to the functional multilingual learning, because you would also like to see this extended not only to the learning situation, but also to assessment. So that kind of starts to boggle the mind. So how would teachers be able to do functional multilingual assessments if they do not know they can't know all the languages of the children in their class? So how would this work?
Right. Yeah. I mean, what we saw, and the reason why we came up with also that concept of functional multilingual assessment was that, to a certain extent, we could convince teachers of exploiting the multilingual repertoires in the learning the learning process, but not when it came to assessment. Then that was just one step too far.
Yeah.
So that's why we decided now we have to investigate and to do some research why that is, and etc. So we set up a couple of research, a couple of studies specifically on that. I think here it is important to make a distinction between, on the one hand, standardized testing and classroom-based assessment, because I think there are limits. I mean, there are limits what you can do with regard to exploiting the plurilingual repertoires in standardized testing. Just logistically, it becomes difficult. However, there are interesting examples of ETS, a testing body, an international testing body, who already many years ago who did some experiments with standardized online testing, where, for instance, when they wanted to test certain kind of proficiency, the test was in English, but certain keywords you got pop-ups in different other languages. This is a kind of accommodation. So in standardized tests, there are a lot of opportunities to introduce all kind of plurilingual accommodations. We did a study on accommodations, a PhD study. My colleague Prof. did that, where she looked at the impact of plurilingual accommodations in a standardized test. What was interesting to see, it was an online test. The children got the test items. There was what we call a control group. So some of the children got the test only in Dutch. They were multilingual. We selected Polish-speaking and Turkish-speaking children. Experiment pupils got the test in both languages, written. So they could switch pages online from the Dutch page to the Turkish page, the Dutch page to the Polish page. There was a second group, an experiment group, who on top of the written dual input, they got also oral input. Because what we see with some children is that it's not only at the written level, but also the oral level, these dynamics. So that kind of accommodations. Now, the fact that the test was online allowed us to log how many times pupils shifted from one page to the other, from the Turkish page to the Dutch page, or from the Polish page to the Dutch page. What did we find? What did we find was that the more the children changed from one page to the other, the higher their scores. So what is the strategy that these children do during the assessment? Most of the time, that's also something we found, most of the time they were on the Dutch page. When they are not sure about the definition, to understand the meaning of a word, they went to the Turkish page. And they went back and again to the Turkish page. The more frequent they did that, to check whether they fully understood the instructions in the test on the Dutch page, the better their scores. Those who switched less had lower scores. Now, in classroom-based assessment, we have much more opportunities to bring in the assessment, to bring in the multilingual repertoires. We have opportunities to allow the children to look up things while they are doing a classroom-based assessment, to look up things online, to use dictionaries. But for instance, if you have more alternative assessment procedures like co-assessment, self-assessment, they can make multilingual portfolios in order to show what their maths proficiency, is. So there you have lots of opportunities when they are doing a group work and you assess the group work. You can allow them to do in preparing the group work to bring in other languages than just the language of instruction. So, but there as well, what we often see is that even in schools or in systems like in our case, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, where we don't have a tradition of standardized tests and schools are fully autonomous to develop their own tests, we still see that they don't use and exploit that freedom to bring in the multilingual repertoires. But in classroom-based assessment, there are lots of opportunities to do that. But here again, it's a question of training, assuring that what the teacher is doing when he allows the pupils to use their Turkish repertoire when they are doing a maths test, that this is fair, because that's an interesting thing we found in the study of my colleague. We interviewed teachers about accommodations and we interviewed the pupils. What was interesting was that the majority of the teachers said, yeah, but these multilingual or plurilingual accommodations are not fair to the monolingual Dutch-speaking child.
Right.
We asked the same question to the pupils, the Flemish pupils. They didn't bother. They said, well, if it helps that Turkish child to do the test of maths better, why not? So there was no openness. There was the pupils were less influenced by ideologies than the teachers were. So, and this was an important finding for us on how to work with the teachers.
Absolutely.
I would like to point one thing out when we were talking about these assessments, because the assessments are done and you as a teacher, you might know that this particular pupil not only speaks, but also reads Turkish and has the necessary knowledge in the language, so the proficiency to understand maybe now the maths problem also in Turkish. This is maybe for those children who are successive bilinguals or who were schooled in that other language. But what about then those children who grow up maybe in Belgium and who start school from the very beginning and are multilingual but are not maybe able at that level of proficiency to read complex texts, to decode complex language?
Absolutely, and this is definitely something what we observe and what we experienced and see with second and third generation migrant children. Their proficiency of their L1 is mainly what we call the proficiency for basic interpersonal skills. They don't have the proficiency in Turkish or in Arabic for the more in terms of more cognitive academic proficiency. But nevertheless, even with those children, and that's why the oral is so important, and that's why we had that experiment with the oral, is that their language proficiency, although they don't master the specific technical maths vocabulary, they still have their, what some people call limited Turkish repertoire, but they have their repertoire which they can use specifically at an oral level to explain to each other, yeah, but this word means that, and there they still have the proficiency in their language. So that's why also in when you do assessments, you not only have to invest in in a kind of dual language teaching only with reading in input, but also with oral input.
Absolutely. Yes.
Perfect. That's great. This is, oh gosh, an hour has gone.
And it happens again.
It happens every time. Our audience is mainly consists of parents, and I would like to ask you. Let's say a parent watches this, listens to the ideas, and thinks, "Well, this would be great. This would make a big difference for my child going to school." So, do you have any recommendations for parents? How can they approach a school to bring this up, to discuss it? You have any tips on that?
Well, one important thing which we found was that not always, but in many cases, again, specifically low SES plurilingual parents often have internalized that monolingual ideology.
Yeah.
They often agree and internalize the discourse. Yeah, in school it has to be only the language of instruction. In our case, it's only Dutch. So that's why it is indeed important to work with parents and to make them aware of the fact that when a school opts for a more multilingual policy and approach, that will benefit their children. Because these parents, more than middle-class parents, are concerned about their futures, their child's future.
Yep.
And they, more than anyone else, rely on the school. And they have internalized the idea that my children will only be successful when the school only invests in the dominant language. So, and the interesting thing is that schools need to be made aware of the fact that it might backfire to the parents. So the schools have to be prepared to that. What I do think is, again, a kind of a mediator is important in order to bring parents and schools together. In many cases, the cooperation or the collaboration between parents and schools with regard to this and other topics is very much a kind of individual relationship. Parents are invited a couple of times a year to come to discuss the results of the children on the tests, and that's about it. What we do see that, and again, those who are in the power position to make the change need to make the first step, and I think the schools are in a more powerful position. And that's why that's why we try to convince schools to change their relationship with the parents and take initiative to work with parents, to take them on board, to take them as equal partners, to work with equal partners. Now, having said that, of course, parents can organize themselves. But my advice is don't just go on your own, because often you don't have enough agency. You're not, there is an unequal power relationship. Yeah. Organize yourself and then invite the school to discuss these issues. And if needed, ask for help from a mediator in the whole process. So, and you have school external mediators who can play, at least that's what we experience, who can play a very powerful role in creating that space of of equality between parents on the one hand and the teachers and the team, the school team on the other hand. But it is a difficult exercise because again, it's what we just said. Schools often accept parents as an equal partner as long as partners do not want to be involved in the didactics and into what's going on in the classroom. And here I do think that there needs to be a bit more openness between, on the one hand, parents and on the other hand, teachers.
Absolutely.
So the parental school dynamics often focus also on the periphery, jointly organizing the annual school festival, and I mean, maybe I'm a bit too negative, but I do think that schools need to be more open to experiment with parents, to take them as equal actors in the education of the children. And parents can ask for space to schools to talk about what they do at home, why they make these choices to raise their children in another language. And again, there a mediator can play a role. That's what we already often did. As a mediator, bringing the parents and the teachers together, allowing to tell their stories, both the parents and the teachers. And then you create a space where there is a much more mutual understanding. When these parents can say, look, for us it is important that our children, that we keep speaking the language because our grandparents live still somewhere in Turkey, and we want to be able that our children can talk with their grandparents.
Absolutely, and that's perhaps something where we also can play a bigger role in making sure that all families appreciate. You say L1. I would it's the home language. It's the language that a child learns first, and like you said, many families still think that school is only for the school language. But maybe Tetsu, you said, what can we do? I think one of our important roles that we have is to make all parents realize the importance of the home language, the home culture, and that it also does have the right to have a place at school.
Yes, and also to be like you said before, that not only that the parents are also the advocate for their children, so for their right to use their languages at school, and that they have to speak up. Right. I know that it's also a little bit a cultural bias sometimes when for some families it's okay, the school will take care of the education of my child and I will do whatever I am told, but it's a two-way kind of communication that needs to happen, so that not only the fears, let's say we were talking about fears or judgments or yes, from teachers towards a very diverse school class, but also from the parents. What can we do? We are the ones who are maybe immigrants, refugees, we are experts, everyone. We all have, I think, the same kind of fears that our children will not function in that setting at school if we do not help them with the school language, etc. But realizing that it's equally important that they have a solid foundation in the home language is important, and so we can scaffold on both sides. And I think this kind of message is something that Rita, Tetsu, and we will never get tired to tell people, whoever I come across. I mean, even any worker in the street, so they say, "What are you telling me?"
Absolutely, Ute. So just to finish today's wonderful session, we could go on for hours. Do you have something? Do you something you would like to like? If you would like, if you had the power to spread a message that you would like all schools to embrace, what would that message be?
Oh, that's the most difficult question of the whole session.
Another hour.
Well, the concept I often, specifically with regard to, I mean, the triangle between the pupils, the parents, and the teachers or the school. For me, what is important for all actors is taking up a position of what I call multi-perspectivity and creating a space of negotiation. What I often miss when I observe what is the dynamics is we live in an era of polarization. We live in an era of binaries, and we have to go beyond these binaries. And that, by the way, that's the reason why we came up with that concept of functional multilingual learning, because we saw that binary of the importance of the language of schooling on the one hand, and what we know what is important about of exploiting the plurilingual repertoires. And I think we have to strengthen the different actors, parents, pupils, and schools. And often I find that that is lacking. Space of negotiation. We have to learn again to disagree.
And discuss.
And discuss. Yeah.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and we've learned so much, and then so many thoughts that all the listeners, us and all the listeners, will take with us, and continue thinking and discussing. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
This is wonderful.
Really enjoyed the session. Thank you, Professor Van Avermaet. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers on Facebook and on YouTube. So I will wrap this up very quickly by giving you a glimpse into what the next session is going to be about. And it flows very well from our discussion today. We will be talking about, weekend language school. So it's a different type of schools that we were talking about, involving different types of teachers, but they're very important nonetheless. Perhaps you live in a different country, perhaps you're an immigrant, expat, whatever the reason, you may already be sending your kids to these language schools. So what are the key considerations? How do you maximize the benefits? How do you get your children to enjoy the whole process? We will be talking about that with two very special guests on November 2nd. So November 2nd at the same time as usual, 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. UK, and 7 p.m. Paris.
Tetsu, I think
yes.
we are in the week of changed time zones, so it will be 2 p.m. New York.
My goodness.
6 p.m. London and 7 p.m. Paris.
I will correct that. You are absolutely right, because I did think about the time change, but I had the illusion that it was changing on the last weekend of October, but it is the following week. So we'll get caught on that again. Okay, I will correct the time for you guys, everybody, but definitely November 2nd, we will be seeing everybody to talk about weekend language schools. Okay?
Okay,
perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Alla prossima.
Hej man, terve.
Sayonara.